here's a person who discovered the most important thing in logic, and he invented the concept of the stored program computer, and he did these wonderful things in biology and cryptography and started artificial intelligence, and he ran marathons and rode bicycles and had terrible sexual problems. And but I don't know anything about this person, and yet here's the key figure of our century, but I don't know him, and I wish I did.
Alan Matheson Turing, mathematician, codebreaker, and inventor of the computer, was born in London in 1912. His father was in the Indian Civil Service in Madras, so apart from the holidays, Alan and his older brother spent much of their childhood farmed out to guardians on the south coast and at boarding school. When he was 10, Alan was given a book which excited and focused his intellectual curiosity. One chapter was about the nature of the mind. Where we do our thinking was to fascinate Turing for most of his short life. In 1926, Turing was sent to Sherborne School. The general strike had stopped the trains, so he arrived by bike. An English public school in the 1920s was not the ideal environment for someone of Turing's particular interests and abilities.
He should do very well when he finds his métier, but meanwhile would do much better if he would try his best as a member of this school. He should have more esprit de corps.
Come on, Shirley!
Mathematics, not very good. He spends a good deal of time apparently in investigations in advanced mathematics to the neglect of his elementary work. His work is dirty. I hope he will not fall between two stools. If he is to stay at a public school, he must aim at becoming educated. If he is to be solely a scientific specialist, he's wasting his time at a public school.
At 15 and a half, Turing wrote for his mother, Sarah, a short account of Einstein's ideas.
He has now got to find the general law for the motion of bodies. It will have, of course, to satisfy the general principle of relativity. He does not actually give the law, which I think is a pity, so I will. The separation between any two events in the history...
A few months later, Turing found someone else to share his passion for mathematics and science.
Well, when he was 16, Alan Turing fell in love with another boy at Sherborne, a boy called Christopher Morecambe. It was hopeless, unrequited love. Must have been very, very painful and difficult to deal with anyway. But it did have some importance for Turing immediately because he became more communicative. He seemed to realize that there was more point to other people, to doing things, to getting on in the world, making more of a success in his academic work. And in fact, the point of his life became really to be a student with Christopher at Cambridge. Now, Christopher, in fact, did win a scholarship to Cambridge in 1929. And then it happened. Christopher suddenly died. It was in February 1930. And Turing was really quite shattered by this.
Dear Mrs. Morecambe, I want to say how sorry I am about Chris. My most vivid recollections of him are almost entirely of the kind things he said to me sometimes. Of course, I simply worshipped the ground he trod on, a thing which I did not make much attempt to disguise, I'm sorry to say. I should be grateful if you could find me sometime a little snapshot of Chris to remind me of his example and of his efforts to make me careful and neat. I shall miss his face and the way he used to smile at me sideways.
Mrs. Morecambe invited him to stay at their house, and they shared something they wanted to see in the meaning of what had happened, that it wasn't just that Christopher had died, but that somehow he lived on. Now, Alan Turing wanted to believe that Christopher Morcom's mind somehow still survived. He wrote to Mrs. Morcom frequently saying he felt Christopher was helping him. But you see, he didn't just want to think of this as a comforting thought, a happy, convenient belief. He had to have a scientific reason for believing this was actually true. Christopher's death inspired him to look very seriously at what modern science was saying about the nature of the mind, how the mind can be embodied in the physical world.
By the time the memorial window to Christopher Morcom had been dedicated, Turing had been up at Cambridge for 2 years. At King's College, science and mathematics were taken seriously, and so was Turing. He was awarded a fellowship at the age of 22. Someone made up a rhyme about it. Turing must have been alluring to get made a Don so early on.
The unique thing about King's College that Turing must have found as soon as he arrived here is that it gave a particular kind of atmosphere of moral support for anyone who was homosexual, as Turing was discovering that he was. And there were well-known figures there who one reads about, people like Maynard Keynes and so forth, who were well documented in their relationships. But it wasn't just that. It's a real sense of moral seriousness, that one should be what one is, and that that's the right thing to be and the right thing to feel. But for Turing especially, he has a very fresh view of everything. He didn't see things in the conventional way. He always had to try to get a different look at everything, and that was the secret to his intellectual work. And this sense of differentness and unorthodoxy is all part and parcel of his sexuality and of his intellectual life as well.
Turing's ideas about computing machines emerged in 1935 when he solved a profound and abstruse problem in the foundations of mathematical logic, Hilbert's Entscheidungsproblem. At the turn of the century, the German mathematician David Hilbert had asked, was mathematics decidable? Did there exist a definite method which could, in principle, be applied to any assertion, and which was guaranteed to produce a correct decision as to whether that assertion was true? Turing later said that it was while out running in Grantchester Meadow that he had first seen how to answer Hilbert's question.
The difficulty of the question, as a mathematical question, is not just about mathematics. You see, it's about what you mean by a method, a rule, a very vague word, a word you might use in everyday life, but not with a clearly defined meaning. Well, Alan Turing gave it a meaning, an absolutely precise meaning, because he thought, well, what would such a rule or procedure be? It would be something you could do mechanically, something that you could do, let a machine work on. And now, in 1935, there were no such machines. This is just an imaginary machine. It's a machine of thought. But he made it into an absolutely definite idea, and it's the idea of the Turing machine. And I can quite see that it would be at one spot, at one moment, they could have seen how you could use this precise idea, and the whole thing would click.
Turing's paper described how any logical process could be broken down into its simplest possible components, precise sequential steps that could, in principle, be carried out by a machine. With this new definition of method as machine, he was able to formulate a logical paradox which rapidly disposed of Hilbert's question.
Only somebody totally original and uninfluenced by fashion could have written that paper. Its purpose, which was not the same as its ultimate influence, was to show that a certain task was impossible. And that, again, is very, very difficult to do, and indeed difficult to understand. Most people would think that if you the fact that people have tried to do something a lot and failed would more or less show that it was impossible. But that's not the case, because one day somebody might find how to do it. And what Alan Matt was trying to demonstrate, and succeeded in demonstrating, was that a certain task could never be performed.
Well, Turing's ideas didn't just stop at the technical field of mathematical logic. His vision was much larger than that. And the thing that really drove him on was thinking, what is a mental process? What is any process by which, by thinking, we could arrive at any conclusion at all? What are our brains doing when we're thinking? And that was the argument in the background of this paper that he then wrote in 1935 and 1936. And his argument was that any mental process, whatever, assuming that the brain works in some definite way, which it must do, it must have a mechanical basis to it, then it must be something which could be simulated by a Turing machine. So he had a way of formulating what any possible mental process must be. That was his general argument. And that's the argument which looms larger and larger in his thought and is now the basis of his ideas about artificial intelligence.
In the course of solving Hilbert's problem, Turing had an insight of the greatest importance. His original conception had required a different Turing machine for each logical task. But he went on to imagine a universal machine which could read and execute the instruction set of any single Turing machine and therefore perform all possible logical tasks. He had, in effect, formulated the idea of the stored program computer.
And it didn't matter too much what the actual hardware details of the machine was, as long as you were sure that the individual steps were dead simple. So he needed some way of imagining this, so he concocted the idea of a paper tape, which had either a 0 or a 1 in each cell, and a very simple imaginary machine which just chugged back and forth, left and right, on this single paper tape, which was imagined to be infinitely extended in both directions. And what he proved was that such a simple machine, with a finite number of separate states in it, each state saying what would happen if you saw a 0 or a 1, whether you'd move left or right, and whether you would erase the symbol and replace it with the other one, or leave the symbol as it is, that's all you needed in order to compute any computable function. So it was a sort of existence proof that there could be a mechanical device which, by simply compounding and iterating all of these simple steps, could do any computation that any human being sitting at a desk and using his wits could do.